Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, written by Shelfie Bennett. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Port girl, one man muttered to his friend. I felt the sting of each remark, a reminder of my family's fall from grace. I moved carefully through the crowd, my senses on high alert. I noticed a man in a worn leather coat and a battered hat standing a little apart from the group. His eyes were sharp and full of secrets, and though I did not know him well, our glances met in a silent conversation, a mix of warning and curiosity. I could tell he was a drifter. he said, his voice low and edged with something unreadable. "I just like knowing when someone's playing a game. And you, Miss Davenport? You're playing one fine as I've ever seen." I felt the hairs on my neck prickle. There was something about him, something knowing, something dangerous. But he wasn't calling me out. Not exactly. No, there was something else in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. "You must be mistaken," I said lightly, lifting my chin. "I'm no gambler, and I don't play games." He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "If you say so." I turned to mount my horse, but his voice stopped me again. "Just a fair warning, though. Secrets have a way of rising to the surface in a town like this. And folks, well, they ain't always kind when they smell blood in the water." I paused, my heart hammering despite the calm I tried to hold on to. Then, without another word, I swung onto my horse and rode off, leaving the drifter and his knowing smirk behind me. As I crossed the outskirts of town, my thoughts tangled like thorny vines. I had spent years learning how to be careful, how to stay just ahead of suspicion. But this man, whoever he was, had noticed me in ways others hadn't that made him dangerous. And yet, as the wind swept through my hair, I could still hear his voice in my ears, feel the weight of his gaze lingering on my skin. That made him something else entirely, a threat, or perhaps a temptation. The dust rose long before the man himself appeared. I was standing outside the dressmaker's shop, half listening to a pair of women gossip about the preacher's wife, when the wind carried the sound of slow, steady hoofbeats. A horse, tired but determined. The women stopped talking, their eyes drifting toward the road leading into town. Then I saw him, a lone rider, his figure dark against the pale afternoon sun. He sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders broad, his frame lean, and though his face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, I could feel the weight of his presence long before he ever reached the town's edge. Something about the way he moved told me he'd been riding for a long time. His coat was dust-covered, his boots scuffed, and his horse, an impressive-looking bay, looked about as weary as he did. But there was no mistaking the strength in either of them. I'd seen men like him before. Drifters. Gunslingers. Men with pasts they didn't talk about and futures they hadn't quite figured out. The townsfolk had noticed him too. Whispers rippled through the street, some wary, some curious. A stranger was always worth a second glance in a place like this, especially one who carried himself like he didn't give a damn whether he was welcome or not. I should have looked away. Should have turned on my heel and gone about my business. But then he lifted his head, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met mine. Everything else, the town, the murmurs, the heat pressing down on my skin, disappeared. His gaze was sharp, unreadable, a shade of blue that reminded me of the sky just before a storm. He studied me, slow and deliberate, as if he was deciding whether I was worth knowing. Something hot curled in my stomach. Then, just as easily, he looked away, nudged his horse forward, and rode past me like I was no more interesting than the dust on the road. Well, that was unexpected. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned back toward the dressmaker's shop, ignoring the way my pulse had picked up speed. Whoever he was, I had a feeling he was going to be trouble. And if there was one thing I didn't need, it was more of that. I hadn't planned to see him again so soon, but later that afternoon when the heat had settled low and lazy over the town, I found myself in the doorway of the saloon, wiping a bit of dust from my sleeve as I waited for a meeting that wasn't supposed to. Not that he seemed to care. He strode across the floor like he owned the place, his boots tapping against the worn wood, his expression cool and unreadable. He passed me without so much as a glance and leaned against the bar, nodding at the barkeep. "Whiskey." His voice was rough, low, like he didn't use it much unless he had to. I should have ignored him. I wanted to ignore him, but something about him, his presence, the way he carried himself, that slow, deliberate gaze he'd given me earlier, made me bristle. Before I could stop myself, I stepped up beside him, resting my gloved hands on the edge of the bar. "I don't believe I've seen you around before." He turned his head, eyes skimming over me. "No, you haven't." I raised an eyebrow. "That's usually the part where you introduce yourself." He smirked just a little. "That's so." I let out a small, humorless laugh. "Manners still exist last I checked." The barkeep slid his whiskey across the counter. He caught it without breaking eye contact with me, lifting the glass to his lips. "Jack Monroe?" His voice was calm, unhurried, as if my presence didn't rattle him in the slightest. I didn't like that. "Celia Davenport," I said, tilting my chin just a fraction. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition? Amusement? It was hard to tell. "I've heard of you," he said after a pause. I tensed. "That's so?" He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Folks say you're trouble." I gave him my sweetest smile. "Funny, I was about to say the same about you." A beat of silence, then he chuckled, deep and quiet, like he actually found me amusing. "I think I like you, Miss Davenport," he said, setting his glass down with a slow, deliberate motion. I hated the way my stomach fluttered. "Well," I said, smoothing down my skirt, "that makes one of us." His smirk widened. "Is that right?" I turned to leave, tossing one last glance over my shoulder. "Welcome to town, Mr. Monroe. Try not to cause too much trouble." His eyes followed me as I stepped through the doorway and back into the sunlit street. I told myself I wouldn't think about him again, but the truth was, I already knew that was a lie. The moon was high when I slipped through the back alleys of town, my footsteps quiet against the dirt road. The night smelled of dry earth and wood smoke, and the distant howl of a coyote sent a shiver up my spine. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and kept moving. No one would follow me, not at this hour. I reached the old barn just outside of town, the wood weathered and gray from years of neglect. Most folks thought it was abandoned, left to rot like so many forgotten things. But for a few of us, it was something else entirely. I gave 3 quick knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. The door creaked open just enough for a pair of wary eyes to meet mine. "It's me," I whispered. The door opened wider, and I slipped inside. The room smelled of hay and damp wood, with the faintest trace of tobacco lingering in the air. A single lantern hung from a wooden beam, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the men and women gathered inside. There were only 5 of them tonight. A man named Thomas, grizzled, sharp-eyed, and always watching, nodded toward a makeshift table in the center of the room. "You got it?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bundle of notes I'd tucked away earlier. "A little more than last time," I said, setting it down. "It should cover the medical supplies, plus the food rations." Sarah, a woman with kind eyes and a scar along her jaw, picked up the money and counted it quickly. "This'll help a lot of folks, Celia, more than you know." I gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach my heart. I know exactly how much it'll help. Because I'd seen what happened to people when society decided they weren't worth saving. My family had once been part of the elite, the untouchables, the ones who never had to worry about where their next meal would come from. And then, overnight, we'd lost everything. I knew what it was to be cast aside, to be whispered about, to be judged by people who had no idea what it felt like to be hungry or desperate or alone. And if I had to lie, cheat, and manipulate to make sure a few others didn't have to feel that way, so be it. "I heard the sheriff's been poking around," Thomas said, his voice low. "He's got questions about where some of these funds are coming from." I leaned back against a wooden beam, crossing my arms. "Let him ask. He won't find anything." Sarah glanced up from the money. "And if he does?" I smiled. "Then I'll do what I always do. Lie." That earned a chuckle from the group, but Thomas didn't look amused. "You're playing a dangerous game, Celia." I met his gaze. "I know." And I did. But danger was the least of my worries. Because even more dangerous than the sheriff's curiosity was the stranger in town who had already started looking too closely. I slipped into my house just before dawn, my boots making no sound against the wooden floor. I pulled off my shawl and sank into the worn armchair by the fireplace, my limbs aching with exhaustion. The room was dim, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. The walls still held traces of my old life. Portraits of ancestors who had once stood tall in ballrooms, a grandfather clock that no longer chimed, an elegant mirror with cracks running through it like spider webs. I stared into the fireplace, watching the embers glow and fade, and let out a slow breath. 2 lives. That's what I lived. To the town, I was the fallen heiress, the woman they pitied, gossiped about, and avoided at respectable gatherings. The girl who had everything and lost it all. But in the quiet corners of the world, in places where no one else dared to look, I was something else, a benefactor, a liar. A woman who pulled strings behind closed doors, who played the game as well as any man ever had, and I told myself it was enough, that I didn't need their approval or their kindness or their acceptance. But as I sat there, staring into the dying fire, I couldn't help but think of Jack Monroe. The way he had looked at me in the saloon, the way he had seen something in me that others hadn't, and the way, despite everything I knew about men like him, I had wanted him to look a little longer. I sighed, rubbing a tired hand over my face. Trouble was coming, I could feel it, and this time I wasn't sure I was ready for it. A forced partnership. I didn't want to work with him, not for a single minute. But when trouble came knocking, I had little choice. It started with gunshots in the night, sharp cracks that split the quiet and sent the whole town into a flurry of panic. I had been locking up my shop when I heard them. The saloon doors burst open across the street, men rushing out, hands on their holsters, looking toward the livery where the commotion had started. Then came the shouting. "Damn fool tried to rob old Hank," someone yelled. I moved closer, staying near the edge of the buildings, trying to see what was happening. That was when I spotted Jack Monroe. Of course he was there. He leaned against a post, his arms crossed over his broad chest, watching the scene unfold like it was some stage play meant for his amusement. The moonlight caught on the stubble along his jaw, the faint smirk on his lips making me want to slap it clean off his face. Then his gaze flicked to me. I looked away too quickly, cursing myself for letting him catch me staring. "Miss Davenport?" His voice was slow, like he had all the time in the world. "Didn't take you for the type to sneak around in the dark." I squared my shoulders. "Didn't take you for the type to stand around while an old man gets robbed?" His smirk deepened. "Who says I'm standing around?" Before I could question him, a shot rang out, and the crowd ducked. Someone shouted from the livery, and that was all it took for chaos to break loose. Men moved fast, trying to get a hold of the outlaw inside the stable, but I could tell right away they were making a mess of it. "Hank!" the livery owner was shouting, his voice hoarse with anger. Jack straightened, sighing like a man forced into a chore he didn't particularly like. "Looks like someone's got to take charge before these idiots start shooting each other." Then, to my complete horror, he turned to me. "You coming?" I stared at him. "Coming where?" "To handle this." I let out a sharp laugh. "You expect me to help you?" He shrugged. "Not what I'd call ideal, but you seem to have a way with words, and seeing as half the men in town wouldn't listen to me if I told them water was wet, I reckon we make a decent pair." "A pair?" I scoffed. "Hardly." But even as I said it, my eyes drifted back toward the livery. The men inside were panicked. Hank was cursing up a storm, and someone was bound to get shot if this went on much longer. I cursed under my breath. Then I turned back to Jack, arms crossed. "Fine, but don't get used to it," he grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it." We stepped into the livery together, side by side, though I hated the way it felt like we were moving in sync. The space smelled of hay and sweat, the flickering lanterns casting long shadows against the wooden walls. A man stood near the back, half hidden behind a stall, his pistol drawn. He was younger than I expected, with wild eyes and a desperate stance. "I ain't going to jail," he shouted, backing up as Hank raised his own weapon. "I swear I didn't mean to hurt no one, just needed a horse." Jack stepped forward, his boots slow against the dirt. "If you didn't mean no harm, then put the gun down before you dig your grave deeper." The outlaw's hands shook. His gaze darted to me, then back to Jack. "Who's she?" Jack smirked. "Someone you should be more afraid of than me." I shot him a glare, but to my surprise, the outlaw hesitated, so I stepped in. "You don't want to die tonight," I said, my voice calm, steady, "and Hank doesn't want blood all over his stable floor, so why don't you put the gun down and walk out of here in one piece?" The man swallowed hard. For a moment, I thought he might listen. Then a shout came from outside, startling him, and his grip on the pistol tightened. Jack moved first. In a blink, he lunged, knocking the gun clean out of the outlaw's hand before shoving him against the stall door. The outlaw struggled, but Jack was stronger. The fight lasted all of 3 seconds before the man went limp, breathing hard. The tension in the livery snapped. Just like that, Hank let out a breath, muttering a curse under his breath as the others moved in to take the outlaw away. Jack stepped back, rolling his shoulders like it had all been too easy. Then he turned to me, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "Not bad, huh?" I lifted an unimpressed brow. "You took long enough." His grin widened. "Didn't want to ruin the fun for you," I huffed, shaking my head. But I couldn't deny it. I felt a little thrill in my blood. The rush of danger, the quick thinking, the way Jack and I had worked together without even having to speak. It was infuriating, because for all the reasons I had not to trust him, for all the ways I knew he was trouble, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time we'd find ourselves standing side by side in the dark, caught between right and wrong. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, save for the creak of the wooden floor beneath my boots. I shut the door behind me, resting my forehead against it for a long moment. My fingers tightened around the doorknob as I exhaled, slow and steady. I needed a drink. Or maybe just a few moments of silence to gather my thoughts. Instead, I made my way to the small room at the back of the house, the only place that still felt like mine. It was a modest space, the wallpaper faded, the furniture simple, but the moment I crossed the threshold, my shoulders loosened just a little. I struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the writing desk, its soft glow casting long shadows on the walls. The light flickered over the bookshelf, filled with books I barely had time to read anymore, and the worn, threadbare chair where I used to sit and dream of a life bigger than this town. A life I lost. I pulled open the drawer beneath the desk, my fingers brushing over the smooth edges of a small velvet box. Carefully, I lifted it out, turning it over in my hands before opening it. Inside lay a golden locket, delicate and untouched by time. I ran my thumb over its cool surface, my chest tightening. It had been my mother's. She used to wear it every day, always tucked just beneath the collar of her dress. When I was little, I'd sit beside her on the parlor couch, tracing the intricate designs with my fingers, listening to her soft laughter as she told me stories about my father's grand ambitions and the legacy we were meant to carry. We were Davenports, a name that once held weight, power, a name that even now people still whispered about in this town, but not with admiration, with pity, with scorn. I had spent years trying to erase the shame that had settled over my family like a stain that wouldn't wash eyes. The ink stained my fingers as I wrote. It is getting harder to balance both lives. Jack Monroe is watching me. I can feel it. If I make one mistake, everything will unravel. I hesitated before adding the last line, and I don't know why, but I can't stop thinking about him. The thought made my stomach twists, so I shut the journal and shoved it back into the drawer. Whatever curiosity I had toward Jack Monroe, whatever unsettling pull I felt when his eyes lingered on me, it was a distraction I couldn't afford. I had barely blown out the lamp when I heard the knock, 3 short raps against the door. My breath hitched. No one came to my house this late. No one was foolish enough to risk being seen on my doorstep unless they had a damn good reason. I grabbed the pistol from my bedside drawer before making my way to the door. Slowly, I cracked it open. There was no one there, but on the porch, just beneath the dim glow of the street lamp, lay a folded piece of paper. I glanced down the street, searching the darkness, but the night was still. Too still. Heart pounding, I bent down and picked up the note, unfolding it with careful fingers. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. You are being watched. Leave town before it's too late? I stared at the words, my fingers tightening around the paper. A chill crawled up my spine. I had been careful with my money, careful with my meetings, careful to keep my name out of the wrong mouths. But someone knew, and if they knew, that meant my time was running out. The storm had passed, but the night still held its breath. The sky was thick with clouds, hiding the moon, and the scent of rain still clung to the dirt streets. The town was quiet now, the chaos from earlier settled, though the air still felt charged, like a match waiting for a spark. And right now, that match stood a few feet away from me, leaning against the wooden post of my porch like he belonged there. Jack Monroe. I crossed my arms, watching him. "You always make yourself at home where you're not invited?" His lips twitched, barely a smile. "Only when I think the company might be interesting." I huffed, but I didn't send him away. Truth was, I had questions, too many of them. I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. "You planning on telling me why you're really in this town, or are we going to keep dancing around it?" Jack's gaze flickered, unreadable in the dim light. He had that look again, half amused, half something else, something guarded. "You always this direct?" "When I need to be." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off something heavy. "I needed a place to stop for a while, that's all." "That's all?" I tilted my head, unconvinced. "Strange then, how trouble keeps following you." He chuckled, low and rough. "You might have noticed, Miss Davenport. Trouble has a way of finding both of us." He wasn't wrong. I leaned back against the railing, watching him closely. His hat was tilted just enough to shadow part of his face, but I could still see the sharp angles of his jaw, the hint of stubble, the way his blue eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. "You're running from something." I let out a slow breath, pressing my fingers to my temples. Jack Monroe was trouble, and Lord help me, I wasn't sure I wanted to stay away from it. The wind whispered through the dry grass as I made my way toward the abandoned barn on the edge of town. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, and the air smelled of earth and distant rain. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and stepped carefully over a loose board as I pushed open the heavy barn door. The hinges groaned, but the night swallowed the sound. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and dust, the wooden beams stretching high above me like the bones Monroe? He saw too much. And worse, I wanted him to. I swallowed hard. This is a bad idea. He nodded, but his fingers didn't move from my skin. I know. For a moment we just stood there, caught between something unspoken. Then, just as quickly as he had touched me, he pulled away, stepping back like he had just realized how close he'd gotten. The cold air rushed in between us. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and straightened my shoulders, forcing the space to feel like it meant nothing. "Whatever this is," I said, my voice steady, "it doesn't change anything." Jack studied me for a long moment, then gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. "No, I suppose it doesn't. But the social gatherings to know when something was wrong. The Davenport name wasn't welcomed in places like this anymore, not truly. But that didn't stop me from attending. If I showed weakness, the town would eat me alive. So I wore my finest dress, my most charming smile, and walked through the room as if I still belonged. But tonight, the whispers followed me. I felt them curl around my back, slipping between the clinking of champagne glasses and the soft rustle of silk gowns. "Did you hear?" A woman's voice, just low enough to sound conspiratorial. "She's been funneling money somewhere. No one knows where." Didn't her father lose everything? And yet, somehow, she's not starving. Maybe she's got herself a benefactor, a sharp laugh, or a business no lady should have. My jaw tightened, but I didn't turn. I kept walking, kept smiling, kept pretending their words were nothing more than wind. Jack Monroe stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching me. I hated how easily he saw things. I hated that he looked at me like he already knew exactly what was being said and was just waiting to see how I'd react. I lifted my chin and strode past him without a word. I could handle a few rumors. I had to handle them. But then, just as I reached the far end of the room, someone brushed against me. Deliberate. Intentional. I turned, but whoever had done it had already melted into the crowd. That was when I saw the note in my hand, a single folded piece of paper tucked carefully against my palm. I exhaled steady and slow before slipping it into my skirts and making my way toward the terrace. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside. The laughter and music were muffled behind me, but the weight in my chest didn't ease. I unfolded the note, my fingers tightening as I read the words. "We know what you're doing. It's only a matter of time." No signature, no mark, just a warning, sharp as a knife pressed to my throat. My stomach twisted. I had been careful. I had covered my tracks. No one should have been able to trace the money, the arrangements, the quiet, desperate ways I had been helping those the town turned its back on. But someone had. The sound of boots scuffing against stone snapped my attention back, Jack. I should have known he'd follow me. His gaze flicked to the paper in my hand, then back to my face. Bad news? I folded the note, slipping it into my pocket. "Nothing I can't handle." His mouth twitched, but there was no humor in it. "You sure?" "I've dealt with worse." He studied me for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable in the moonlight. "Rumors are spreading, Celia," I scoffed. "Rumors have been spreading about me since the day my family lost everything." "This is different," he said quietly. "These people, whoever they are, they don't just want to ruin your name. They want to take everything from you." Something sharp lodged itself in my chest, fear, anger, a mix of both. I had worked too hard, lost too much to let them, whoever they were, undo it all. Jack sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Tell me what you've gotten yourself into." I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "No." A slow smirk touched his lips. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "I've been told." His smirk faded, replaced with something almost concerned. "You can't outrun this." I lifted my chin. "Watch me." The challenge hung between us, thick as the night air. Then Jack shook his head, stepping back. "Just don't get yourself killed." I forced a smile. Wouldn't dream of it. But as I watched him disappear into the dark, my fingers curled around the note in my pocket, and for the first time, doubt crept in. Because I wasn't so sure I could outrun this. Not this time. The sun was low in the sky when I stepped into the old general store. Dust hung in the golden light streaming through the windows, and the air smelled of wood, coffee, and stale tobacco. Thomas stood behind the counter, his broad frame stiff as he stacked a crate of canned goods. He didn't look up when I entered. That was my first warning. The second came when he finally did glance my way, his brown eyes sharp, unreadable. "You're late," he muttered, setting a can down harder than he needed to. I raised a brow. For what? For telling me the truth. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "What are you talking about?" Thomas turned to face me fully, crossing his arms. "What you tell me, Celia? People are whispering all over town, saying you've been moving money around, making deals no decent woman should be making, and now there's talk that someone's got proof." My pulse quickened. "You believe that?" "I believe you've been lying to me." His voice was quiet but firm. "I believe I've stood by you, risked my own neck for you, and maybe, just maybe, I was a damn fool to do it." I swallowed hard. Thomas had been one of the few people I trusted, one of the few who had helped me when I had nothing, and now he looked at me like I was a stranger. "I never lied to you," I said, keeping my voice steady. His jaw tightened. "Did you tell me the truth?" Silence stretched between us. I couldn't answer, not honestly, and that was answer enough. Thomas let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I don't know what you're doing, Celia, and I don't think I want to." A lump formed in my throat. "So that's it?" His eyes softened. Just a little. "It has to be." I should have fought harder, should have found the words to make him believe in me, to stay, but I didn't, because deep down I knew, if he had to ask, if he had to wonder, then I had already lost him. I found Jack later that evening, leaning against the railing outside the saloon, smoking a cigarette. The setting sun painted the sky in oranges and purples, but my world had already darkened. "You heard, didn't you?" I said, crossing my arms. Jack exhaled a slow stream of smoke before flicking the cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "Depends on what you mean by heard." I clenched my jaw. "Don't play games with me." He tilted his head, his blue eyes searching mine. "You really want me to say it?" "No, I didn't, but I nodded anyway." Jack sighed. "People are saying you've been scheming, pulling strings behind closed doors, lining your pockets with money that doesn't belong to you." A bitter laugh escaped me. "And you believe them?" He didn't answer right away. And that pause, that hesitation, cut deeper than anything Thomas had said. "You're really asking me that?" His voice was quieter now. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I don't expect you to believe every word that comes out of my mouth, Jack, but I did expect you to know me better than this." His jaw tightened. I thought I did. That stung. He turned away, staring out at the street. "I don't like lies, Celia." I exhaled sharply. "Neither do I." "Then tell me the truth." He faced me again, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing with the money?" My pulse pounded. I had spent years keeping my secrets buried, knowing the moment I trusted the wrong person, it would all come crashing down. But Jack Monroe was not just anyone, and that was the problem. He saw too much, knew too much, made me feel too much. If I told him the truth, he could ruin me, but if I didn't, "I can't," I whispered. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I can't help you." Something in my chest cracked, but I lifted my chin, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I never asked for your help." A muscle in his jaw ticked. He took a step closer, and I hated how my breath caught, how I felt the heat of him even through the space between us. "You want to know the worst Calloway spread his hands. I have a witness. A figure stepped forward. Thomas. The breath left my lungs. His face was tight, unreadable, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I saw her, Thomas said, voice steady. Moving money, making deals. She's been lying to everyone. A fresh wave of whispers filled the room. I felt like I'd been punched. I knew Thomas had been angry. I knew he had walked away, but this was betrayal. I turned to Jack. His face was unreadable, his eyes locked onto mine. But he still didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't say a word. I was alone, and the realization burned. The following everything blurred after that, voices shouting, accusations flying. I heard my father's name, my family's ruin, dragged through the mud all over again. You think she's different from her father? Someone spat. Stealing runs in her blood. We should have never trusted her. The sheriff ought to lock her up. My skin burned with shame, my breath tight in my throat. I clenched my fists, fighting for control, but the weight of it, the humiliation, the betrayal, the damn pain of it all, was suffocating. I forced myself to stand tall. I never stole a dime, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Not for myself, Calloway scoffed. So you admit you were moving money in secret? I had to get out of here. I turned to leave, pushing through the bodies, my ears ringing, my chest tight. Then a voice cut through the noise. She's telling the truth. The whole room went still. Jack. He stepped forward, slow and steady, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. His gaze locked onto Calloway's, then drifted to Thomas, and finally, to me. She didn't steal, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. She gave. She helped people this town ignored. That's the truth, Calloway frowned. And how do you know that? Jack exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Because I followed her. A fresh wave of murmurs ran through the crowd. Jack glanced at me. His face was still unreadable, but his next words were clear as day. She was helping widows, orphans, people who had no one else. I swallowed hard. Jack Monroe? The man who never got involved, the man who had every reason to walk away, was defending me, Calloway sneered. And we're supposed to take your word? Jack's smirk was sharp as a blade. Reckon I'm more trustworthy than a man who never opens his purse for anyone but himself. Calloway's face darkened. The mayor cleared his throat, raising a hand. Enough. We'll settle this properly. Sheriff will investigate. I didn't hear the rest, because Jack was beside me now, his voice low. You all right? I didn't trust myself to speak. I should have been angry at him, furious for doubting me in the first place, but all I felt was relief. And maybe, just maybe, something more. The wind carried the scent of dust and rain as I stood at the edge of town, facing the people who had tried to ruin me. Reverend Calloway was there, his face